the exceeding beauty of the earth and her splendor of life yields a new thought with every petal. The hours when the mind is absorbed by beauty are the only hours when we really live, so that the longer we can stay among these things, so much the more is snatched from inevitable time. Hey folks, and welcome to episode 26 of If I Ruled the World, the system change podcast that's all about talking to the thought leaders, the change makers, the disruptors, about how to make the world a better place. I just read you a quote, a line from a book called The Life of the Fields by Britain's, and by all accounts, the world's very first nature writer, Richard Jefferies, who was writing back in the 1800s, just as the UK, and by default the world, was gearing up for the Industrial Revolution. He was at odds with this changing world around him and was almost prophetic in his writing about the coming slow boil of industrialization. And it's for this reason and more, which you'll hear about in this episode, Jefferies is very much with us in spirit as we speak to today's guest, Bevis Watts. Now, Bevis is Britain's, and by all account, the world's first environmentalist banker, and he's the boss, the CEO of Triodos Bank UK, which you might recognize as the exclusive sponsors of this podcast. I hope you do anyway. Bevis is widely regarded as a leading figure in financial system change and is helping, together with his team at Triodos, helping show how the banking system could be put into service to people and planet. Having earned a first-class business degree and a PhD in management science from Swansea University, Bevis began his working life at the pioneering recycling charity WRAP. He then hopped between Triodos and the nature conservation sector for a while, where eventually he was the CEO of Avon Wildlife Trust. But he finally made the move to head up Triodos Bank UK, the UK subsidiary, and I'm going to give it its full weight title here, the UK subsidiary of the ethical and sustainable Dutch bank of the same name, which exists to change the banking system and to use money for positive change. As you might expect, speaking to someone who's come to banking from environmental and nature, the conversation hops between Bevis's professional views on the banking system, but also on his personal reflections on nature, ecology, and even the soul. But we start with the poignant story of how Bevis got his name. I just wondered if you could explain the origins of Bevis.
I can. Well, I believe the origins of the word Bevis are actually from France, and it came to the UK in about 1066, and it means Belfis, or that was what it derived from, beautiful sun. So
Wow.
I hope that's true. But I know what you mean, and the name Bevis comes from a character in some books written by an author called Richard Jefferies. Mm-hmm. And Richard Jefferies is widely regarded as Britain's first ever nature writer and often credited for being the first person to use the term wildlife in a nature context. And he was writing in the late 1800s. And last year was the 175th anniversary of his birth. So there's been a bit of a renaissance and a lot more awareness about his work. But I suppose two things really that I've learned as I've got older, there's more to the name. I mean, my father named me Bevis hoping I had as good a life as the boy, because in the books, the boy is kind of free and exploring nature and with his sort of friends, and also with a strong moral undertone of doing the right things by others is a strong sort of message in some of the books, and particularly those less fortunate than himself. But I guess my father would have been reading Jefferies' books. He had me very late in life, but he would have been reading his books in the 1950s. And in the 1950s, if you were wanting to read nature books, you wouldn't have had a huge amount of choice. And so Jefferies, in his day, was a hugely sort of celebrity author. And that carried on. And if you think of the vast choice of books we have to read now and the selection, it would have been very different when my dad discovered that book and in a sort of post-war era and so on. Yeah. But Jefferies' writing was also very broad and holistic. He wrote about the intensification of agriculture. how he saw that would create social inequality. He wrote about the workhouses and things. So a lot of the stuff he was writing about, and he wrote a mix of books and papers, but a lot of the things he was writing about more than 150 years ago and so on are still true today. And so, yeah, I think there was something my father tried to give me in the name, in kind of doing the right things by others, sort of really being connected to nature. But I suppose as I've got older, I've discovered Jeffries' broader body of work and what he was writing about. And unfortunately, we're still to unlock and change a lot of the systems and things that he had concern with.
So, yeah, because looking into some of his work and what people have written about Jeffries, what it sounds to me like was he was a bit of an outlier at the time, I guess. And I imagine he was writing in a world that was waking up to, the kind of positives of industrialization. All of a sudden you could travel across the country by train with very little personal physical effort, whisked around the country, all that sort of stuff. And he wasn't I guess he was maybe I use this kind of expression, awake to the slow boil of industrialization. Like he was quite prophetic almost in some of his writing, credited, I think, writing the first dystopian English language dystopian novel, I think.
That's right. After London, yeah.
After London, yeah. So how much of that did you know growing up? Like, how aware were you of that name?
So I was very aware I had a very unusual name growing up. And actually, I think because the director of the Richard Jefferies Museum tried to track down all the Bevises he could. And I think there's only 3 of us in the UK. Although there's also a Bevis Trust, which is a rewilding project in Carmarthenshire. So I was very aware of an unusual name. And I suppose as a child, though, I had the simplistic version of we named you after this child, hoping you had as good a life as the boy. And that, you kind of this moral undertone, you do the right thing by others. What's been nice for me, I mean, obviously I lost the opportunity with a father who was terminally ill in his teens and died when I was 20, of really then being able to have the deeper conversation about that and what he knew about Jeffries and other works. So I suppose it's been an ongoing exploration of the name, the author, and his works in my adult life that has very much sort of continued to inform and shape who I am. But yeah, I suppose the central premise of someone connected to nature and being also a kind of message of freedom and exploration and independence. There's no parents in the books. It's just a story of somebody independently exploring and working out what the right thing to do is on some occasions. That's definitely shaped me lifelong. But it continues to. And I know you've discovered Richard Jefferies yourself and as part of the anniversary. And it's very thought-provoking to think what he was writing about, as you said. It was prophetic, and we haven't addressed some of these things today.
Yeah, the Attenborough of his time is how I've heard him described. Almost spiritual, or maybe spiritual, not religiously, but he definitely, of the little I've read now, he definitely seemed to write about nature in a way that, is it fair to say, hadn't been quite sort of touched by science in the way that I've learned about nature, and probably most people listening to this. I mean, would you say that's fair to say?
I would. I would say it's much more about a connection to nature through the soul. And, if you think of the life he would have lived, he grew up on a small farm near Swindon, but he would have spent whole days walking through nature to get to places like Savernake Forest, walked miles and miles and miles and spent the entire day in nature, probably foraging in nature, writing in nature and walking back. But you get a very sort of poetic, soulful sense of why nature mattered and what it meant and being within it. And that's probably, to your earlier question, that's probably one of the sad things we've lost as a species ourselves, and that fuels this disconnect between the environment and our economy and our systems.
You were talking about, discovery and self-discovery being a big part of how you've ended up doing what you're doing, the environmentalist banker. I don't know, do you feel comfortable with that title? Does that...
Well, it's not really a title. Somebody just described me once as the first environmentalist to run a bank, I think, when I first got the job. So it is what it is. Yeah.
Because I remember that's around the time that I started hosting events for Triodos. And that's when I met you and the team and started pestering you guys basically for sponsorship for the podcast. Thank you. I remember that was also around the time that you made a discovery that was nothing to do with your banking role. But it was very intriguing. And I don't know if you wanted to talk about that, because you mentioned losing your father when you were like an emerging adult.
Mm-hmm.
And that I remember when you and I sort of had a conversation around this amazing discovery. You wrote the book, and in the book is when you talked about how you hadn't really unpacked and really worked out what that impact was, that all those life experiences all came together in this discovery on a river, and then you wrote the book. So I just wondered if you could pull those threads together for our listeners.
When was it now? In 2021, I suppose I'd been long overdue taking some time off and just reconnecting with myself, because Brexit had a very big impact on this business. And it was a time of life where I had to turn myself inside out to create a new bank in the UK effectively and transfer everything across. And then the pandemic hit, so I never got a chance to take a break, because you just turn yourself inside out again to keep everybody's sort of services running and everything else. So, but yeah, I've always felt at home and I suppose most connected to myself and most at peace when in nature. So I've often sought adventures and time in nature. And some former colleagues of mine from the Avon Wildlife Trust said, there's been a report of a beaver on the River Avon. Would you get out and have a look for them in your kayak? So I did, and I just became addicted and spent mornings getting up at 4 a.m. to get out on the water at 5 to go and try and spot beavers, and found they were there, but quickly realized they'd been there for a very long time. So I wrote a book that's kind of sharing the joy of that adventure and my joy of wildlife, and how I sort of feel very connected and centered and peace in nature. But I guess also it was a very reflective time. And there's lots of metaphors in what I was exploring and so on that I tried to draw together in terms of thoughts on the rate of change we see addressing things that are staring us squarely in the face as threats to humanity, the rate of change being so slow. And beavers are a great metaphor for that, because we've spent decades arguing about their release, despite lots of science supporting all the positive impacts they can have on biodiversity and flood mitigation and everything else. And that's not to say they don't need management, but really, honestly, the time we've spent debating these things, it's a story that's too often told. We spend so long debating things and not acting or not changing ourselves and taking individual action. Yeah, so it's partly a story of sort of personal discovery and well-being and restoration, and also, lots of my own thoughts on the importance of the natural world and how we take it for granted, and how it should be more to the fore in all our thinking about day-to-day life and how we interact with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the metaphor I also like about the story of beavers sort of slowly spreading naturally, accidentally around England and Scotland is that they're just sort of getting on with it while we were busy debating. And there is something there for me, definitely.
Well, the beavers I discovered on the River Avon, Gillian, the beautiful thing was I managed to prove that they had been breeding for several years and nobody knew they were there. People thought it was just one random beaver. And I mean, there was one family of 7 just in one lodge that I was monitoring with camera traps, and it just proved the point that there's all this fuss, but nobody really knew they were there in a peri-urban environment. Nobody even noticed.
I just love that, all the debating, and they just literally just crack on, don't they? They don't waste time.
Yeah.
So using money for positive change is the system change challenge, isn't it? That Triodos, and I guess the work that you've thrown yourself into. That's the system change challenge you've set yourself. Money and nature, money and positive change aren't words that most people think of that go together. Maybe let's start with money, because we've done a little bit of nature. How would you describe money to someone who's maybe never encountered it, or someone who uses money all the time, but it's like, what is it? What does it do? How does it actually shape the world we live in?
Yeah, and I suppose a metaphor I've often heard for money really is you need to think of it as blood is to the human body. It's the thing that flows around in our society to reach sort of various things that need things translating to them, if that makes sense. It moves the energy and so on around our economy and our society. But I mean, fundamentally, there's lots of different types of money. I mean, there's gift money where you're sort of doing things philanthropically and doing things out of will. We as a bank engage with investment money and loan money. which are things that are designed to sort of deliver sustainable financial returns for people and so on. But the most important thing about money is that there is no such thing as neutral money. So everywhere you choose to spend, save, and invest your money has an impact. Everything. And most people just sort of subconsciously think, I put, my savings or the money that I'm not using sort of day to day, I put it in a bank. And they think it sits in a vault somewhere, as per a sort of movie, in piles of notes. When the reality is banks are lending that money out. I mean, that's how banks work and earn money, is they lend a large proportion of the money that people deposit with them. And then the question comes, well, what's the impact of that? If there's no such thing as neutral money, what is your bank doing with your money? Is it in your long-term interests? Is it creating the type of society that you want to live in? And that same story is true whether you're talking about your pension funds. Equally, it's about your purchasing choices. The products you buy, we're much more conscious of. Where does my coffee come from? Where does my chocolate come from? These things we're becoming more conscious of. But actually, what are our savings and our investments and our pension funds doing is not something most people think of.
Is it that, at risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, is it that people don't think about it, or is it that banks, or most banks, I can't sort of make a sweeping generalization, but is it that there is a deliberate lack of transparency, do you think, about where your money goes?
So it's a bit of both. As a society, we've just been on this kind of economic trajectory that just making money from money is a good thing to do in our society. And actually, a huge proportion of our economy in the UK is the financial services sector. So we globally are a major leader in this industry and this problem. But it is also a case of lack of transparency as well. And one of the things that sets us apart as a bank is we've always published details of every loan and investment that we make. So if you're a customer of the bank, you can be the one to judge whether we get decisions right on whether we're using money for positive social, environmental, and cultural impact. And so that's fundamental. But you could ask the vast majority of banks, and they wouldn't disclose to you the details of all their loans and investments. And that's something we really need to shift and change. I don't think that's something that's kind of anti-market forces or anti-competitive or anti-capitalist. It's actually just creating a new form of competition and awareness about how people use money.
So if there is such a thing as ethical banking, which is what Triodos and other banks, I guess, other ethical banks do, how would you really unpick what unethical banking is? Where does unethical banking, where do they put their money?
Yeah, in a way, it's almost easier to answer that question in reverse, because the term ethical banking actually covers a broad range of things. It might include sort of Sharia banking in some people's definition, everything else. We're very clear in the mission of Triodos is to create a fair and sustainable society, and that's the kind of totem by which we judge it. But I suppose how we see it as different is firstly how you use the money. And we set very high minimum standards to say we won't do fossil fuels, we won't do mining, we won't do heavily extractive polluting industries. So that wouldn't be true of the vast majority of the banking sector. So some will set minimum exclusions, some will say they're fossil fuel free, but then they might still be fueling property price increases with second home mortgages. And so it's very deep consciousness, whether you're seen in the ethical banking space or not, it's what you do with the money. But it's also then about how you run the organization, and are you fair and transparent with customers on your pricing and how you treat them? And that's a very fundamental principle of it as well, how we run the bank. Do you pay performance-related bonuses to incentivize the wrong kind of behaviors? And we've seen an industry that post the financial crisis was exposed for all sorts of scandals that were going on this kind of making money from money principle being a good thing, and to maximize the profit and return in doing so. And then I suppose lastly for us, it's also about the footprint of the business itself. So we're renowned for what we finance, but it's actually a real core principle that in every aspect and every sinew of the business, we think about the highest environmental, social standards in terms of how we treat our employees. And, the fact I'm sat in a meeting room with a table made from recycled wood and cladding made from recycled wood. I'm sat on an organic woolen chair. The small things, but that add up. And we've been one of the original sort of members of the B Corp movement since 2016 and the first pan-European bank to have that status. And it's only one way of looking holistically about a business's performance. But it's almost easier to make the comparators because everything I've just said you wouldn't say is true of the vast majority of banks in how they use the money, the behaviours and how they run the bank, and also their own footprint is something that is still in the kind of corporate social responsibility space, which means it's sat on the side of a desk. It's something you do after the impact of your core activities, as opposed to we've never had a CSR policy or a CSR team. The message is
CSR being, sorry,
corporate social responsibility.
Okay. Thank you.
We've never done that. It's always been about actually every decision, every consideration must think about these issues.
Well, Bevis, honestly, I thought I should have known it wasn't going to be that easy to get you to answer the question in reverse.
Sorry. Well, but I mean, you can find out. The proof point in what I've said is there are organisations like BankTrack that will show and expose the extent of fossil fuel investment by the largest banks in the world and how that has continued to track upward since the Paris Accord was signed, and it's dipped down a little bit in recent years, but still nowhere near the kind of pathway that we need to see. So you can call out all sorts of those things to say, do you really want your money to be doing that? Is that really what we should be doing as a society?
Yeah, good questions. I mean, which actually sort of leads me on to, because we talked about fossil fuels, but one of the things I'm genuinely really proud to say, particularly because of what is a hot war in the Middle East right now, is that Triodos doesn't put money into the arms industry. And I tend to say that as a big kind of blanket thing, but could you go into some detail? I know it's not necessarily one of the responsibilities that you sort of look after directly, but could you just explain the impact that could have in positive change, where we could be doing better as a society in terms of transparency around that? And then sort of a three-part question is maybe if you've got any knowledge on this, what the military industrial complex impact is on climate and on the environment, because we tend to think of it as a human rights issue, but obviously that's incredibly important. But what impact will that be having as well on a war far away and will be impacting every single person everywhere? So how how would you say the bank's activities change that?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a very interesting and challenging topic. So we have never financed anything to do with arms. As I say, we set very high minimum standards, and that was excluded, even before the bank was first incorporated. It was very clear that's not what we're here to do. I suppose, though, some people, interestingly, have challenged that of late, and not so much on the banking side, but in the investments universe. And we, as a bank, have an asset management business that manages funds investing in large companies and screening them for best in class and so on. And there's been a whole kind of debate about whether arms shouldn't be included in what are called ESG funds. And ESG stands for environmental social governance. It basically means it's the lowest form of kind of sustainable investing in that what you're doing is you're screening companies to meet certain criteria. It's not what we do. We're impact investing, really trying to achieve positive outcomes. But in those ESG funds, people have made the case that arms should be included on the basis that sort of national security and human dignity and freedom should be protected, and that arms help do that. And so we've published a thought leadership paper or blog denouncing that and saying, actually, this could never be part of a sustainable society. This is not going to move us to a more inclusive, equal, fair society if we're kind of accepting this as a given. And then I don't have the data to be able to quote, but inevitably, from what you've just said, I mean, the environmental impacts, not just the carbon emissions, but the environmental impacts of wars are devastating. And then obviously there's all the knock-on effects of our carbon emissions, because things we would have historically sourced from certain geographies are now being sourced from completely different places in the world. You saw when the shipping had to be diverted around the south coast of Africa and so on. Imagine the emissions of that, of a month or two's shipping diverted hundreds, if not thousands of miles. So the ripple effects are huge, and it's just another reason why we would advocate it shouldn't be considered a part of anything that's presenting itself as sustainable investment.
Why do you think it is that more banks haven't followed suit, given that there is more awareness, given that there is to a degree, a demand? Why do you think more banks haven't followed in Triodos' footsteps?
Well, I'd say the primary reason it is a lack of demand. I mean, I've spent many, many years now trying to influence thinking and advocate how money should be used in society with greater consciousness. But the vast majority of people are not in that space and that mindset. So I think most people put their money with their bank and don't give it a second thought. And so if that's what the banks have to react to and they have complete freedom, then so be it. I mean, I also think the banking industry is one that hasn't necessarily thought it needed to have any form of social conscience. And I remember talking to the board member of one of Britain's biggest banks years ago, and they said, well, it's not our job to tell government what to do. So long as it was lawful, they were willing to finance it. So whether it was right or wrong or really in their long-term customer interests, as long as they were operating within the law and made money for their shareholders and for their own sort of bonuses and benefits, it was fine. And so we've ultimately designed a financial system that doesn't have that moral compass built within it. And the only answer to that is going to be to regulate banks differently. And if I can give you a brief example of what I mean by that, in the last few years, we've seen a lot of debate around greenwashing. So people offering products that aren't as environmentally or socially positive as they're made out to be. So we've gone and introduced a whole load of regulation to prevent greenwashing. But the impact that has is that banks like ourselves that are doing things with very high environmental standards and benefit and even pioneering things like nature-based investments, we have the highest burden of proof to show that what we're doing is as good as what we say it is. Meanwhile, you have no burden of proof to show that you are financing fossil fuel expansion or financing net emissions way above the curve and trajectories we need to be achieving to hit statutory net zero targets. So we need to draw much stronger red lines around the industry. And again, I would often get sort of criticized in this discussion about you're being anti-competitive, this is anti-free market. It isn't. It's just changing the rules in which everyone has to operate. And we've made steps in that direction, but nowhere near enough. And until we have really mandatory net zero targets, mandatory transition plans, and actually have real leadership in putting regulation around things people can't finance, we won't get the change we need fast enough.
So what I'm hearing is that for you, system change through the financial sector isn't necessarily about like burning the house down. It's not a revolution. It is about just changing. Is it shifting the goalpost, changing the rules, as you say? Because quite often, and we've had many guests on the podcast and in the kind of environmental climate campaigning space, there is a lot of certainty around capitalism being just something that's got to go. So I'm not hearing that from you. And I just wanted, before we get into, well, why don't you think so, if I've understood that correctly, could you just, again, going back to sort of like first principles, just explain what capitalism is? Because I think it's a word that gets thrown around a lot. It's so familiar to so many people, but I suspect that a lot of us are walking around with different definitions of capitalism. So what is it from a banker?
Yeah, I mean, so sorry, actually, there's a slight misunderstanding because there's two different things. I think we need to change the financial system from its current state, but the financial system is only one component of our economic system, and we advocate for real, quite substantive change in our economic system. I mean, we live in a society obsessed with GDP, gross domestic product, which measures the success of our society on how much we spend, therefore how much we consume, therefore how much natural resources we burn through on this planet, effectively. So for many years, we've advocated change away from that system. And a capitalist society inherently is one that is dependent on perpetual growth. And on a planet with finite resources, that's just not possible. So ultimately, we've been great advocates of Kate Raworth's theory of donut economics, which is rethinking how do we manage an economy within planetary boundaries and use those resources sensibly, and also ensure everybody has a minimum level of subsistence that delivers a sort of reasonable quality of life. So that's very much where we come from as a bank. And we've actually also published a paper recently on our position on post-growth or degrowth, which are often used interchangeably. You know, how do we get away from this paradigm of only sort of seeing our success of our society on economic growth?
Okay, so maybe this is actually exposing my understanding of capitalism to be slightly out of whack. Because for me, when I sort of get into this conversation, I'm hearing two different things. One is consumerism, which is where I think the whole growth thing comes in, perpetual growth models, overconsumption, etc., runaway consumerism. And then on the other hand, there's capitalism, which in my head, and correct me if I'm wrong, is a system whereby I have an idea and I want to make that idea into reality. I just don't have the funds, the resources to do it. So someone lends me some money, I get to make my idea a reality. And in return, they get their money back and then some. And in my mind, if it's regulated properly, that isn't such a bad thing because it allows innovation. It allows progress. So just unpick it. Have I got that completely wrong?
No, I don't think you've got that completely wrong. And I suppose to your early question, in a banking context, I suppose where capitalism is negatively perceived is this notion of just making money from money and maximizing that. And that is different to what you've described. I mean, essentially, we're a real economy bank. We lend to real people and real organizations doing what you said, who are trying to affect something positive, need some support to do that and fulfill their business plans. But ultimately, as I was saying earlier, we have a financial sector that is largely making money from money and designing instruments to do that. And that has become something we're very addicted to. And that is something we think we need to change, because it's not just consumerism that's therefore fueling that perpetual growth bubble. I mean, I could get probably far too detailed and deep on those aspects of financial instruments and things that we need to change, which isn't appropriate. But let's not do that.
I can feel you're like, oh, come on, I want to go. Listen, maybe why not? Because maybe this is the place to bring in this kind of idea, just a thought experiment of like, Bevis, you rule the world. You get to enact certain policies and ban certain things. And some of that might be this kind of detail that you would love to get into, but you're like, oh, is it appropriate? So let's just begin with the If I Rule the World game then. And Bevis, you've been elected democratically, of course, and you are now in charge of the entire planet. Like first of all, what we usually kick off is there anything that you would ban just straight off the bat?
So, I mean, the first thing to say is I take a very holistic view of sustainability. It's not just about climate change and CO2 emissions, but that is the glaring sort of issue we have to address. And so something as a bank we've supported and were the first bank to sign up to is something called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so I would move to ban fossil fuels and really think about a different energy mix in our society. And that has to be done in a very orderly way, though. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty is trying to say, well, how can we in an organized way make various commitments to move away from this in a way that is reasonably fair and just to different economies and societies and so on. So, yeah.
Okay. So I just need to check, though. Have we just elected Bevis the man or Bevis the CEO of Triodos Bank UK? I'm happy with either, but I just wanted some clarity there.
Okay, sorry, you have to tell me what you voted for, Gillian.
I would say that I in my mind, when I cast my vote, I was voting Bevis the man.
Oh, well, that's well, that's fantastic. I'm a bit
aligned with Triodos.
he's a little bit he's a little bit wedded and to too long in the tooth as a banker now. But but all joking aside, I mean, I struggle to get away from some of the sort of economic systems thinking that I've spent such a large part of my life devoted to now. Because obviously I spent part of my career working for a wildlife trust as well, but I know how hard it is to affect real change and systems change there. So I have all sorts of thoughts on what I might ban or what I might change. And as I mentioned earlier, how we measure our economy and really making more dramatic shifts and putting red lines around things, I think are the only way we're going to make the progress we need to.
Okay. So I know natural capital, the idea of natural capital, the idea that you can monetize landscape features, you can monetize, levels of biodiversity so that then it can become valued in some way in our economy. So if you were ruler of the world, where would you sit on this idea, this concept of natural capital? If you could do a radical change, would that be part of it, or would you have a different approach?
To be honest, if I answered personally, actually the concept of natural capital probably wouldn't feature. You'd probably have laws and fiscal systems and so on that would just recognize nature is fundamentally a really important thing to all our well-being, and we completely take it for granted, and we need to value it very differently and just respect it and nurture it. But the reality is, I think that's not really a realistic ambition. So I'm trying to say personally, I just think we should value nature, respect it, use it. The reality is, and I think it's important to talk in reality and be pragmatic and practical. We're trying to make an enormous shift in our society to really rebalance the things we were talking about earlier about living within planetary boundaries and supporting nature's recovery to assist our future prosperity. So natural capital actually isn't a bad concept, but it needs to be sort of delivered and thought about in the right way. So I was taught economics at university, and in all the economic models, you were just reassured that, that's fine, that's an externality. So basically, you'd look at the models of economies and the systems around those, and then basically externalities were things that sat outside of that you didn't need to worry about. And the natural environment was one of them. And I think now, one of the things I would do immediately as rule of the world, I think, is rip up all of the historical economics books that we're still teaching largely in universities and say, actually, that's ridiculous. You cannot see your economy as completely separated and detached. So the concept of natural capital, in that nature should have a value, that we get all sorts of things, whether that's clean air, clean water, flood defenses, pollination, all the things we get for free from nature has a value, is not inherently a bad concept. The reality is, because the thinking that follows on from there is, for that to have value, somebody has to be obligated to pay for it. And that will come through regulation and legislation and so on. And it's happening because we're now having statutory targets or voluntary targets businesses are choosing to accept. So is that valued in an appropriate way, and one that is really recognizing that value in a way where the economic value will be enough to repair it over time and restore it? So that's a question. And equally, as soon as these things exist, they end up being exploited, and people now set up businesses around natural capital consulting and investment just to, again, make money from money. It's just yet another way of using and deploying money and selling expertise. And so, I think we need to be very careful and mindful as to supporting natural capital develop, but ensuring it delivers the broadest social benefits alongside that as well. And so inevitably, we have to have some sort of compliance and control that will sit within some of these markets and structures, which is yet to come, because it's kind of been, it's, as things do when they first start out, it's a process of exploration, and people, a little bit Wild West.
Yeah, but I guess it is, because it is having to really, as you say, you're trying to be practical, but also as you trace back to where some of these decisions are made, where these models are constructed, if you like, of how our world should work, that eventually gets to sort of mindset, how we're educated, possibly indoctrinated into believing, well, certain things about what money should and shouldn't do, and what money is there for, and how much of it is enough, all these things, right? I guess what's interesting to me is, as someone like you who's clearly got like a personal kind of reverence for nature, but a practical, pragmatic approach to how do we work with where we are. Where do you think that uncoupling of economy and ecology, when did that happen? Where did that, maybe not necessarily the kind of original sin moment, but perhaps more about when did we really get to a point where this revved up? I mean, a lot of people point to the Industrial Revolution, industrialization. Do you see it like that? And how do you restore it if we can?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's been various inflection points, but post-World War II was another big one, where the industrialization of agriculture really took off for food security reasons, and countries sort of really trying to mass produce food and store food and so on, which meant for a greater depletion of the natural environment and a reinvention of our countryside and so on like never before. Similarly, some years after that, the financial system also had to be reinvented, and there was something called the Bretton Woods Agreement that came into effect, and that kind of laid the foundations for the modern financial system as it is today. And the late 1970s started to see the deregulation of banking in the United States. And ever since then really that has, in my mind, fueled that decoupling in all the things we were talking about earlier. The make money from money culture has fueled that. So I don't think you can point to any one thing, but you can see a number of things that have just spun quicker or accelerated that decoupling.
So, yeah, I mean, World War II, food security, but also I guess it was an industry that had been sort of feeding the war machine, pivoting to using the same technologies and materials and repurposing it for food, pesticides, etc. Industrialization, World War II, those are kind of familiar. Bretton Woods has been mentioned once before on this podcast, but never really unpacked. Is that something that you can help our listeners with a bit more? I'll have to start chipping away at someone who can really talk.
No, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on Bretton Woods, but I mean, essentially, it was the international agreements about how our financial system worked. And I mean, I suppose what's more relevant and the thing I'd like people to really understand is it always seems so hard to change these things. But ultimately, our financial system is not one of the givens on this planet. It's entirely man-made. It's entirely manufactured. And I spend my life talking to people that will find barriers and reasons, we couldn't possibly do that this way, or we couldn't possibly do that. And it's just not the role of regulators to step in and do these things. And I scratch my head and think, well, hang on, who defines the role of the regulators? Oh, yes, so we have. And it happens through parliaments for which we vote for. So we need to just, I think, to take a step back and have some perspective that we're operating in systems that were designed decades ago that were thought to be the appropriate ones of the day. And we have to sort of step back and think about what is it we need for the next 50 to 100 years and make our best estimate of the systems we need and how we need to change them. So there are many people who talk about reinventing Bretton Woods and rewriting it and reconvening that and the basis of our very financial systems. But I'm not one of those people, so I won't be able to go into the detail.
Well, I'm putting a little marker there. We've slightly drifted away from the policies. If you're as ruler of the world, did you have sort of your policies already lined up that you were gonna enact as ruler of the world?
Well, I mean, I had some, but I fear that they're going to be too aligned to the bank and financial change and not enough of Bevis' big picture. What would he like to change in the world, Gillian? So, yeah.
Well, let's hear from the bank then, Bevis the banker.
So, okay, yeah. I mean, so at a global level, I mean, I would be fascinated to think, how do we, with this end goal of living within planetary boundaries and having an economy that operates within those, we ultimately need to have that consideration through every policy area that we operate, any government. And so in the UK, we've advocated something called the Climate and Nature Bill, which I think's a really interesting concept that tries to put climate and nature central to all forms of government thinking and policy in every government department. So I guess one of the things I'd be keen to enact in that policy framework as a global leader and so on would be something very similar that just put the requirement in every consideration. How do we bring this to the fore? And it's a bit like what I was saying about corporate social responsibility earlier. If it's just something that we're dealing with once we have the symptoms, we're never really going to achieve that kind of vision of operating an economy and a society within planetary boundaries.
So making climate, nature, environment central to almost every government decision, policy, activity, etc. Okay.
Yeah, and there's a movement of organisations trying to affect that and bring that into being in the UK. So obviously, I would just apply that globally.
Let's just do that, but everywhere. Okay. And do you think? I mean, just what I find really curious is that you've been doing this work for some time now, and you've yet to be convinced that this isn't the way forward. Like, it sounds to me that you've had to really challenge and fight off challenges and work to persuade people that operating the financial system in a way that centers nature and human dignity as well. You've basically never let go of that as your principle. And what I'm trying to understand is what it takes to be someone who is almost sort of swimming upriver, going against the grain, is sort of an outlier. Like, what does it take to be that person? Did you ever think you would be that person? And how do you maintain your, I guess, perseverance with it?
It's a great question. It's not something I've thought about a lot. I suppose I've often felt like the outsider in the room. Somebody once said to me at a conference, how does it feel to be the person staring at the backs of the people who think they're stood outside of the box? Which was, I think, a huge compliment. It took me a while to work out what on earth they were saying, but I think it was a huge compliment in that myself and lots of colleagues as well do think very differently and have tried to call out longer term the things that we want to change in the financial system and the banking industry and more broadly. I mean, we often make calls or try to have a voice in different sectors. And I touched on farming earlier and different systems that need to change as well. And in fact, we try to work across 5 transition themes and sort of publicly say these are the areas we want to change and affect. Yeah, I suppose more on the personal question, though, I suppose I have been told repeatedly for years by all sorts of very powerful people that could never happen. You know, that this is a slightly crazy way of thinking, only for them to see them then happen 5 to 10 years later. Mm-hmm. And the people start to then regulate banks in a certain way, or banks start to adopt ideas that have just become things that we've talked about. And actually, the nature-based investments work you mentioned earlier was something that I very much was personally passionate about and championed, having come from working for a conservation organisation into the bank way back in 2016. And at the time, lots of people, even internally, thought this is a crazy thing to be investing money in. Nature investment. How does that work? It's all grants and philanthropy and so on. But I often get huge imposter syndrome in that, and you inevitably get huge knockbacks and think, crikey, well, maybe I should just keep quiet. Maybe I shouldn't have asked that very challenging question in that seminar or whatever. And I suppose that's a healthy thing to have. But I think I just keep going and persevering because I suppose I take time to try and build confidence in what it is, in what my view is, in terms of depth of reading, in terms of who I talk to, who I use as sounding boards and so on. But I hope that gives you some sense of how I try and get that platform of confidence. But it's not to say all the insecurities aren't there, and it does often feel quite a vulnerable place. When I've done voluntary work overseas, many years ago, I was tagging flatback turtles on a World Heritage Island called Barrow Island, which is the Madagascar of Australia. It's been separated for 8,000 years. So there's 24 species of animal found on that island, nowhere else in the world. But unfortunately, one of the last acts of a previous Australian administration was to allow a liquid natural gas pipeline to come ashore there. And I was there, part of the team creating the baseline data, then monitor the impact of basically those operations over time. And when you're there sort of working through the night, because turtles come up on, at night to nest and so on, and you're waiting for them to nest and then try to sort of catch them and tag them and monitor them and size them and things. You're there working through the night by moonlight in this incredible space that's just so nature rich. You really think, crikey, how on earth can we do this here? And so I'd love to see much more rigorous protection of the natural environment and sort of real efforts to sort of almost mandate its recovery and restoration of certain areas and reconnection of different landscapes and habitats as well.
So you achieve that. You've got 2 last tasks.
Done.
One is to nominate a successor and then retire to a happy place. So who would that be and where would that be?
So on successors, I couldn't come up with one answer, but I really think that we need to be giving a greater voice to the next generation. And so I make a point of following the likes of Greta Thunberg and Maya Rose Craig and umpteen sort of activists and Clover Hogan and all these people. So I would love to think I'm passing on the baton to somebody, younger, female, better representative of different communities and future societies. So I won't give one answer, but I'll give you a sense of a collective of people I find quite inspiring, and I think we need to listen to more.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where would you retire to? Where's your happy place?
I'm not sure I'll ever retire because I'm one of those people I think that needs to have a strong sense of purpose and will always be busy in my head thinking about things and wanting to affect change. But my happy place will be somewhere by water, on water, somewhere nature rich. So I'll be in a kayak or I'll be scuba diving if I had the opportunity, because that's my great love.
Right.
Yeah. Deeply connected to nature and then resting peacefully afterwards.
think that conversation was a great chance to hear what system change looks like, feels like from the leading edge. What it feels like to be, as someone put it, the person staring at the backs of the people who think they're outside of the box. To be told for years by all sorts of very powerful people, as Bevis puts it, that ideas and concepts he put forward could never happen, and then only to see them happen 5 or 10 years later. There's no secret sauce. It's just time. The time taken to examine, to build, to shape new ideas, whether it's through depth of reading, having the right people around as sounding boards, taking the time to have those conversations. Basically, the quiet, hard graft. Plus, perhaps in Bevis's case, the gift of that name. I definitely want to dig in future episodes into some of the things we touched upon, but didn't really get to unpack. So specifically, I really want to find out more about the events around this Bretton Woods agreement. Basically, this monetary system that was set up back in the 40s, post-war, and it still governs how countries do business today. It still governs how money, the lifeblood of our economies, as Bevis describes it, how money shapes the world. Let me know what your takeaways are, as ever. You can comment on Spotify, you can comment on Instagram, you can email the show on podcast@gillianburkevoice.com. I'd absolutely love hearing from you guys. Lovely comments like this one on Instagram saying that me and the team, and yeah, thanks for acknowledging the team, producer Sam and editor Jake, that we are producing a podcast that is an honest breath of fresh air, bringing much needed dialogue for all who seek evolution and not revolution. Thanks for that. Sometimes I feel we need like a big fuck off revolution, to be honest. But yes, evolution maybe is less painful. Who knows? Discuss. Let me know what you guys think. Also, this one, a comment from Sean who says he's absolutely loving the podcast and stunning questions from yours truly. And the podcast, If I Rule the World, is his new favorite podcast. So yeah, Sean, we aim to please. And thank you very much for that. We've also had some of you get in touch with your suggestions for future guests, for future topics to cover, which of course we're working on. And I'm really excited about some of the upcoming guests, some really influential thought leaders in this space of system change. So yeah, keep listening, follow, like, comment, but most importantly, please share this episode with at least one person, anyone who you think is going to really enjoy these conversations and get some value out of them. And last but by no means least, a big thank you to Bevis for making the time to speak to us, and a huge thank you to Triodos Bank UK, the exclusive sponsors of If I Rule the World. Just a huge thank you guys for not just the support, but for being like real champions and cheerleaders of the podcast and making these conversations possible. There is so much going on in the world, guys, right now. So much injustice, so much just horrifying inhumanity. And I'm being really outspoken about it on my social media, while also trying to remember that we still, through it all, need to practice joy and gratitude in our everyday, remembering to connect with our loved ones, connect with our community, always holding on to that hope that there is scope for healing more, for loving deeper. So as we leave you with this beautiful soundscape, courtesy of Mother Nature, planet Earth, our one and only beautiful home, take a moment and take a breath and ask yourself, if you ruled the world, what would you do? Thanks for listening.